Hi everybody, my name is Justin Maas and I'm a portrait artist from British Columbia, Canada. I primarily work in dry media, so graphite, charcoal, pastel, and as such, most of my work ends up on paper. And that's what today's video is going to be all about. Okay. The most common question I get from other artists with regards to materials is about paper. What kind of paper, what should I use, that sort of thing. And that's what we're going to go over in this video. We're going to go over the types of paper that are out there, the different qualities of those paper, what paper would be right for what kind of reference. And as well, at the end, I'm going to do a quick demo to show you how working on different paper would have different effects on your piece. Okay. So let's head over to the drawing board. I want to go through the various lines of paper that Strathmore has to offer, because this video is going to be all about Strathmore papers. There are other brands out there that are great, but personally, that's my favorite brand, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so I'll head over to the board and we'll get started. Okay, so welcome to my drawing board. So now I want to talk briefly with you about how we can identify paper in the Strathmore line. So this is a typical Strathmore pad. And you'll notice when you look at the cover, there's a number of different things that will help us to identify what we're looking at and what we're looking for, okay? Some of them are pretty obvious or easy to understand, how many sheets there are in a pad, what size the pad is, whether it's got a coil or a glue cover, things like that. But then there's other stuff that you may not notice that are important, and those are really what are going to help us to make the differentiation between the different lines, okay? The first thing, we're going to talk about this at length, is the series number, okay? That's important. The second thing is the type of paper it is. And the third thing is the surface, okay? As I said, everything else, whether it be a coil or a glued edge or the size that it is, those are really kind of personal preference, okay? But when you look at the series, that's kind of the starting point with which you want to look at Strathmore papers, okay? Almost all of the Strathmore papers have a series number, and it starts at 100 and it goes up to 500. 500 being the absolute best paper that they make. So this being a 400 series is almost the top of the line. And then the 100 series tends to be the better value, a little bit more economical. 100 and 200 series paper is great for things like sketching, doing roughs, doing studies, that kind of thing. I've used it a lot extensively in figure drawing, where you do a 5-minute drawing and then you move on to the next sheet. There's nothing inherently wrong with using 100 series paper for any type of drawing, or 200 series. The big difference is that they tend to be thinner paper. And they may not have as many different types of surfaces, which makes it a little bit more difficult if you're trying to do a really finished drawing where you need to build up a lot of layers and things like that. So most, serious amateurs and professional artists tend to stick with the 300, the 400, and the 500 series. So that's primarily what we're going to be talking about, okay? So I'm just going to put this one aside for a minute, and I want to pull out a 300 series, okay? So remember what we talked about on the first pad. Here's the series, okay? Here's the type of paper it is. So this one's Bristol. The other one was sketch paper. And then there's the surface. So this is a smooth surface, okay? And again, there's things like the size and the number of pages, and you can see that this one's edge glued, right? So it's not a pad. You would draw on this and then you pull out the sheet once you're ready. Okay, 300 series is really the start of the professional line of paper. It's a very nice acid-free surface. All the Strathmore is acid-free, but it's heavyweight, right? This one is 270 grams per meter square, or 100 pound. It's a really nice surface to work on. It's a smooth surface, which is my personal preference, but they also make it in a vellum if you like to have a little bit of texture to it. And it's overall a really nice paper, okay? But if you're sticking with Bristol, the next step up would be a 400 series Bristol. Now, the other thing you may have noticed as we pulled these out here is that there's different colors. So as well as the series, Strathmore has actually made different colors, okay, which helps us to determine which is which. And it really helps when you're trying to pick out different papers. Now, you may have noticed this is a 400 series, and so is this Bristol. And we'll talk about that in a minute. First of all, I want to talk about the fact that these are both Bristol surfaces, right? They're both smooth, but this is a 300 series and this is a 400 series. So the difference here, this is a 2-ply paper. It's a little bit heavier. It tends to hold a little bit more layers, but depending upon the way you work, you may actually prefer one over the other. And there's nothing wrong with either of them. They're both really great papers. And just to throw a real wrench into the whole thing, here's a 500 series Bristol, okay? So the 500 series is on white. I believe all of them are. This one is actually a vellum surface, which is not my preference, although I do work on this from time to time depending upon what it is. It's also a 2-ply, but it's quite a heavy paper. And the big difference between this and the other two is that it is 100% cotton, okay? So the difference between these is if you were to take these three, they're all acid-free, they're all pH neutral. If you were to frame these two with a substandard backing board or a mat that maybe had not a neutral pH, they could be, acid is introduced to the paper, whereas the cotton tends to resist it. It's, the bigger advantage of this 500 series is that it is really as good as it's going to get in terms of protecting your work. That said, I have no hesitation using either of these papers for finished work, because as long as they're framed properly, there's nothing wrong with it, right? They're great surfaces. In fact, sometimes I find myself preferring the 300 series Bristol to the other two, just depending upon the drawing that I'm doing, okay? Now, as well as drawing certain, traditional drawing surfaces, in the 400 series, you also have things like this, which is a pastel. There's watercolor papers. There's all kinds of different things like that. But we're primarily going to be talking about the ones that I use the most. Now, I made note of the fact that the 400 series Bristol is brown, right? This one's a brown paper, and it's a 400 series. And yet some of the 400 series that I had already shown you are green, okay? And the difference here is that the green is actually a recycled series. So these papers are toned, okay? So these are toned blue. They also have toned gray and toned tan, okay? This, as you'll notice, these ones are all 11 by 14, which is actually my preferred size when I'm doing portraits. This is a great surface, and we're going to actually do a little bit of a demo on this. For drawing, it's a medium surface, so it's got just a little bit of tooth, but it's still quite nice and smooth. It's really one of the best papers out there for those kind of build-up graphic, white charcoal and dark portraits. It's overall just one of my all-time favorite papers, which is why I use so much of it. Now, remember that I mentioned that one of the things we need to look at is the type of paper that it is. So these ones, and they're coiled along the top, are the 400 series sketch paper. But they also have toned 400 series mixed media paper, which is it's the same tone, right? Same tone, but this is a much thicker paper. It's actually like a cardstock, whereas this is just a thin drawing paper, okay? So things can get confusing, but if you pay attention to the series first, right? That's the first thing you're going to look at. Am I looking at a 100, 200, 300, 400, or 500 series? Then look at the type of paper it is. Is it sketch paper? Is it Bristol? Is it mixed media? And then the type of surface, right? Is it a vellum surface? Is it a smooth surface? Sometimes, and this is a tricky thing that Strathmore does, they will call smooth, they'll call it plate. So just be careful with that. The 500 series, I believe, is plate surface, not smooth, but it means smooth. And then, you decide on things for personal preference, like what size it is, whether it's a coil. With Strathmore, if they're coiled and they have a perforation, it's actually printed right on the cover. You can see this one doesn't have that because these ones are not perforated, but these other ones are. Okay. Yeah, so I think that's enough to kind of get you started on that. Now, in the next segment of the video, I'm actually going to show you some images, and I'm going to just talk about how I personally would pick my reference and my paper and how I would match those two together. So let's just put these boards away and these pads away, and I will pull out some reference and we can go through that. So very briefly, I want to go through some reference images and just kind of off the top of my head tell you what I think I would use if I was going to do drawings of these. Okay. So for example, this particular picture, there's a lot of very interesting values happening here. And, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll squint in an image and just sort of see what really pops out at me. And you can see there's lots of really nice darks. And yet there's also some very strong contrasts with some very sharp edges, right? This hat is throwing a very obvious shadow, and that creates this very sharp edge. And so an image like this I would almost certainly do on a toned paper, because it will allow me to really break those hard edges and make them very sort of contrasty, okay? Whereas this image, because it was taken on an overcast day, doesn't really have a lot of brights. If you look at this image, the brightest parts are like the sky and a little bit of her shirt. But even the highlights in here are very, very soft. So I would probably do this on a white paper where I'm just going to be using graphite. Okay. This one's deceptive because when you look at it, you say, okay, well, there's not a lot of white in it. So you would probably do it on a white paper and just use graphite, right? But there's things that I can pick out of this. For example, there's little areas of white in here. There's a white area there right above the lip, and on the chin here, there's some subtle whites that are starting to come out. So I could actually draw this on a toned paper and make it more dramatic by really pumping up some of those highlights and then really coming into some of the catch lights in her eyes and making those stronger. So I probably would actually do this on a toned paper, and I might pick something like the toned blue, which is a darker toned paper. This one's a perfect example of a very sort of flat, neutral picture. So obviously, I would probably want to do this on something that was just graphite, or maybe just charcoal, but I wouldn't need the contrast of white charcoal and graphite, or white charcoal and charcoal. So I would do this on a solid colored paper, but I actually think I would lean towards doing this on something like a printmaking paper or something like that that's just a little bit off-white, maybe even a pastel paper. And both of those are available in the Strathmore 400 series. This is an interesting one too, because when you look at her sort of face and her hair and that, there's not a lot of strong highlights. So you might think, okay, we'll do this on a white paper and just use graphite. But when you look at her dress, those whites would be great if we could actually draw them in white charcoal versus using the white of the paper. So this one's, I'm not sure. I'd actually have to think about this one for a while to make that decision. This one's also the same, right? This one has a lot of areas that are white. So you might say, okay, if you were being faithful to this image, maybe you would change some things around. But let's say you were going to be faithful to all of these images. I mean, quite often I would only take part of the image and change things around. But let's just say that we're going to be, a slave to the reference and we're going to be faithful to it. There's a sort of tendency when you look at something like this to say, okay, well, we'll do that on toned paper because there's lots of nice whites. But what's the most important part of the image? Well, it's the two girls. So maybe we don't want to really strengthen up the whites that are not the primary focal point. So I actually probably would do this on a white paper and let those darks and the contrast and the values build up the image versus doing it on a tone paper where you would actually be more likely to put your focal points in the wrong place. Likewise, this one, I probably would do this on a white paper, even though there's a real desire to make that edge nice and white and these areas white. In the face, you would find that if you were just to focus on some of the whites, it probably makes the focal point of the picture, which is her, beautiful expression and smile, less likely to be important. So if you worked on something, now, of course, you can work on a toned paper. You could do this on toned gray, but not add in the white. But it's a little bit harder if you do it that way. So I would probably stick with something like a white or, an off-white like the printmaking paper, that sort of thing. This one I just included because I thought it was such a great pose from my friend. But yeah, a lot of white, right? There's a lot of sort of bright colors in this, and a lot of contrast, right? Because her outfit is dark and all of her skin is quite light colored. This would be a tricky one. I feel like I would probably lean towards doing it on toned paper. And again, there's no right or wrong. Sometimes you start working on one surface and then you say, oh geez, I should have probably done it on, yada yada. So I think that I would lean towards toned on this one, but I'm not 100% sure. This one, these two actually are quite similar in the sense that they're both lots of bright light, and then the faces themselves are actually fairly neutral. So these two for sure I would be working on a toned paper. I would probably do this on a toned gray or a toned tan, which are a kind of a lighter tone by the Strathmore, in the Strathmore tone lines. And this one I would almost certainly do on a toned blue because it's very dark, right? The blue is almost a bit of a misnomer. It is blue, but it's almost like a dark gray. So the tone gray and the tone tan work very similarly. It just depends on whether you want a warmth to your paper. But the tone blue is great when you have really strong contrast, right? And there's all this beautiful light that she's backlit there. So this one, again, even though there's a lot of darks, right? We've got some very dark areas. Because her face is very kind of neutrally, there's not a lot of contrast happening in there. You might think, okay, I should do this on tone paper because we've got some nice lights in there, and tone paper traditionally makes darks look darker. But if you were to do this on tone paper, I can almost guarantee you that your focal point would not be as strong as if you did it on a singular, white paper or what have you. Okay. Another figure drawing. This one's a little bit trickier because there's the beautiful area of white that's kind of just hitting the side of her face and her shoulder, but then there's a lot of neutrally stuff as well. And because there's a lot of detailing in here, I feel like I probably would choose to do this on a white paper. But again, there's no right or wrong. And this one, I actually would probably, so they're similar in the sense that they're both figurative pieces, but I actually would probably do this one with the tone paper because it tips the scales, right? There's just that much more white in certain areas. So, and this one is one I actually intend to do in pastel, but it would probably be my, even though if you remember the one I showed you of the two girls with their backs to the railing, this one I think you could do on a tone paper, even though it might take away some of the focal point, and that is because of this shadow here. This shadow here is going to help ground the whole piece, and I feel like even though your eyes are going to be drawn to the white parts of the picture, this shadow is going to help you bring it back in. We're going to have a nice sharp edge around here, and I think this piece would be fairly successful on a toned paper. And then this one is actually the drawing that we're going to do as a demo in the next section. And it's one of those pieces that I think could go either way. And because of that, I'm actually going to do what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take 4 sheets of paper and tape them together in the middle. And I'm going to draw this over it so you can see how the reference works on each of those different things. So let me just go get the paper and we'll get started. Okay, everybody. So I've made this sort of Franken paper by combining 4 different types of paper. Okay. So the top corner, the top left, is a Strathmore 500 series Bristol in a smooth. Sorry, I've grabbed a vellum, but this is actually a smooth. The top right corner is a Strathmore toned blue sketch. Okay, so the thinner. The bottom corner is a Strathmore toned tan mixed media. And the bottom right corner is a Strathmore printmaking paper. Okay, so they're all a little different. Hopefully this is going to be okay because the sketch is actually a thinner paper, whereas the mixed media and the Bristol and the printmaking paper are all fairly close to the same height. But I wanted to put this one in just to kind of show you how it feels different. Okay. So this is my first attempt at drawing on 4 different papers at once. Let's see how it works out. I'm going to start off with a 2H, which would be great on these two and mostly on this, but I'm not sure how well it's going to show up on the toned blue. One of the things I mentioned earlier is the toned blue is really, it's more like a really dark gray. So the toned gray and the toned tan are very, very similar in kind of the tone of them, right? So if you were to take a picture of the toned tan and the toned gray and then make them both grayscale, you'd find that they were very similar in tone, whereas this one is quite a bit darker. And that's quite useful for areas that need a lot of contrast. So I'm just going to start off by, yeah, that feels a bit weird, by kind of, I don't know how well this is going to work as far as getting the likeness right, but I think it should illustrate what I'm trying to do. I just want to kind of get her face laid in there. It feels definitely very weird to go across these different surfaces, but what I wanted to be able to do here is kind of explain to you, I mean, I use all 4 of these papers on a fairly regular basis, and I wanted to be able to explain to you how it feels different as I'm drawing, okay? So this Strathmore Bristol is very, very smooth. Okay, and I can feel my pencil kind of gliding along. The Strathmore toned blue it's also fairly smooth, but it feels just a little bit grainy as I go over top of it. Okay, so we're gonna have most of her face is actually like her eyes, her nose, and part of her mouth are actually going to be on the blue. And then this part, which is the printmaking paper, is very, very rough. In comparison, it's not a rough paper, but in comparison with these two, it's quite rough. And then this one being the mixed media is also quite a bit rougher, even though these are both toned papers. This mixed media one does handle differently than the toned sketch papers. Okay, so I'm like sliding underneath. That's kind of funny. I told you it was the first time, so it'll be a miracle if I can make it look like her name is Tanisa. It'll be a miracle if I can make this look like Tanisa, but I'll try my best. And as I said, hopefully you can kind of see. So one of the first things that kind of jumps out as you look here is how, even though this is a 2H, which is a very hard pencil, you can see it quite well on the white or the light colored papers. Even the tone tan is not bad, even though this is a mixed media, but the tone blue is very, very dark, right? So it's hard to see it. So I'm going to switch now to an F. If you've never used an F is very much like an HB. I think the only real difference, that I believe the F actually stands for fine. So F and HB are almost always, depends on the brand, but they're almost always the same hardness, but the F will normally sharpen to a finer point. So I tend to prefer the F over the HB, but they're about the same in terms of actual softness. So we've got her nose there, her eye is going to be around here. Just going to throw a little bit of kind of overall shape and trying my best to get this mapped out so that I know where her face is supposed to be. This would be her hair. And then I like this picture for this particular, because I knew I was going to be drawing it 4 quadrants. I kind of like the idea of her wearing that scarf, and I can, use the sort of volume off of that. So up until this point, I'm holding my, even though this is about paper, I always kind of like to throw in little tips about drawing. You can see that I'm holding my pencil very far down. Now I want to add some darkness and some details, and now I cinch up on my pencil. You have more control that way. I'm not going to use too much pressure because I don't want too much graphite shine. A good paper like a Strathmore tends to be your best bet against graphite shine, right? So using certain papers will definitely have a better effect than others. But you still have to watch how much pressure you put down. So you can see that as I start to use this F on the white, it's quite a bit more dramatic or more value than on the blue area. And even on, I think that the Bristol shows a little bit better than the Printmaking. Okay. So now I'm going to try to put in a little bit in the way of details. Okay, so you can see I'm cinched up on my pencil here. Okay, one eyeball, there's her eye. Lid, there's a bit of a value shift in here. So I'm just mostly trying to kind of map out these planes, make sure that I have them pretty accurate. And I mentioned when in the last part of the video, I'm not exactly sure which paper I would choose. I'm going to sharpen my pencil now. Sorry, I used an electric sharpener. I like to give you a warning in case you're watching this with headphones on. I'm not entirely sure which paper I would have used if I was going to draw this just on one piece of paper as opposed to a Franken paper. This is tough because the bottom of her lip is like right over top of the 2 papers. But I think that I probably would lean towards a toned paper just because of the lovely light that's happening on this side of her face, right? So I'm just going to plot in that eyelid. This is that edge, and we're trying to pick it up on the other part of the paper, which is never easy. But it's starting to get some decent values in there. And then there's that kind of section of her forehead that is giving off there's a plane right there that we kind of want to put in values on. Okay. So that's probably about where I would get to now if I was going to be drawing on this paper. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab a white charcoal. Okay. And I'm going to really kind of hone in on the areas that are lighter. Now, I don't want to use too much pressure because if you look at the reference, like there's not that many areas that are really, really bright white. So I'm going to start, a mistake that people make a lot of times when they're working on toned paper is they jump in and really use a lot of pressure on the pencil. But if you come in and just very, very lightly kind of add in where you want, you can always go over it again, right? It's no different than working with graphite. I think people feel like because it's a white charcoal pencil, they should just use it full force. But just like you vary your pressure with a graphite pencil, you do the same with a charcoal pencil. So just kind of coming in, I'm adding a little bit more pressure in certain places because I know that those lines are going to be more sort of dramatic. The other thing is, obviously, I've switched to the white charcoal instead of building up more graphite, and the reason is that graphite can kind of live on top of white charcoal, but you cannot really put white charcoal over top of graphite. So that is the reason why, I normally start off by blocking things in and then I switch to the white, okay? And you can see how this has, it allows me to kind of build up that area of the face, which I wouldn't be able to do in the same way if I was working on a white paper. Okay, and that kind of is, we can put a little bit of white in here. There's a bit on this eyelid, but we don't need much. We will kind of just lay in this white for now, and then when we move back into this section of the drawing, we'll add in some more darker white. But you can see it's already starting to kind of get some form. Now obviously when I switch down to this part of her face, I can't do that. I have to use the white of the paper to make the areas white. So on the lips here, for example, if I am able to add in a bit of white like this on the top part, because we're on the tone paper, when we do the bottom part, what I have to do is really kind of, and I've switched to a 2B now. The green tape, for anybody who's watched any of my videos before, my 2B always has a piece of green tape on it, just so that you know which one I'm using. And then just very, very lightly, I'm laying in some values here. Okay. And you can see how the two are quite different, right? You have to approach them differently because the paper is different. Now, your decision on whether you would use a toned, like a dark tone paper, or a light tone paper may be entirely personal, right? You may decide, I don't like working on a tone paper, or I want to work on a white paper, or whatever. Or it may be at least partially influenced by the reference, right? So I'm just going to kind of try and add in a little bit of dark here, just so you can kind of see how once you have that white in and then you add in the dark, it becomes more obvious what's happening there. So dark in the nostrils, and a little bit of dark around here, kind of adding in that. Okay, and this is a 4B, which obviously is a bit darker. If I was working exclusively on a lighter toned paper or on a white, I probably wouldn't be using the 4B yet. So a lot of your choices with materials will be influenced by where you are and what material you're using, right? What medium or surface, right? What prepared surface you're using. So you can see that as I start to build that in, it's starting to take shape. The darker toned paper is obviously giving it some volume, but it's still very much a sort of medium value part, because we haven't built up a lot of values yet. So now as I go over across from the tone blue into the white, you can see that I'm actually easing up on my pressure here, but you can see that it does, the lines kind of get made on the white paper much, much easier, right? And they have more impact. And it's funny because I always think of the Strathmore toned sketch as being quite a smooth paper. And it is. I mean, it's relatively smooth, but compared when you draw on them at the same time, it's crazy how much smoother the Bristol is. It's very, very smooth. And I work on both of these papers all the time, and yet I've never noticed how much different, because I've never made a Franken paper before. So it's an interesting exercise, actually. Okay, I'm gonna just sharpen my pencil. So in here, I use so that's using the same amount of pressure, right? See that pressure right there, and then on the white, the same amount of pressure. And yet you can see how much darker it looks on the white because there's no tone, right? It is white. And the mixed media is a different sort of beast altogether. You know, if you wanted to, you could switch and put in watercolors. You could add markers or ink or whatever. It'll handle anything quite well. So it probably builds up a little bit slower than the traditional sketch paper, but it's also a really nice choice of a surface. So you know, the one thing when you're choosing a paper, people ask me a lot of times, you know, does brand matter and stuff, and I think it does, simply because I think that, you know, if you work with a surface that's made by a good brand like Strathmore, what you end up with is a consistent quality. Okay, so you may say, oh, I don't like working on this printmaking paper, and that's totally valid, but you'll never question the quality of the paper, and that's kind of important, that, you know, none of these would be the wrong choice. Any of these would be good, but one of them might be a better choice for you personally or for a specific reference. I don't know how well you can see on the video, but like the lines over here are very kind of flowing, whereas the lines on the printmaking paper do tend to be more jagged. Now that's not necessarily a problem, depending upon how you want the piece to feel, and also depending upon how you finish it, because obviously as you start to build up the drawing, you know, you will add more and more and more. You'll fill the tooth. And I think that on the printmaking paper, like I'm putting a fair amount of pressure here, versus the Bristol. I believe that the darks over here will actually end up being a little bit darker, although they're both pretty close at this stage, right? I think that if you wanted something that had some really, really dark areas, you'd probably find the printmaking paper might do that a little bit better. Whereas like on here, you can see the darks. Even if I take that same pencil and I really try and add in dark, what I'm going to end up getting is a lot of graphite shine in there. So I'm better off now switching. This is an 8B woodless. This is about as dark of a pencil as you're going to get without switching to, you know, some kind of a carbon hybrid. And it's a little bit darker, but you know, you're still never going to get the same sort of contrasty drama that you will with the other papers, right? So okay, so I think that's probably about where I'm going to take this drawing, because it is you know, obviously there's only so much I can do when I've got 4 different layers, but hopefully that's helped you to explain kind of how different papers handle different parts of a drawing. As I said, having done this now, I feel like I probably would stick with a tone paper, although there would be some nice options in terms of transitions in some of the softer areas on her face. So I don't think that any of these papers would be a mistake. Any of them would be okay. I don't believe that any of them would be the wrong choice. It would really be a personal sort of decision, and you know, it also obviously is based on your style and how you work and what have you. But as I said, the main thing really is to make sure that you're using a good quality paper, because any of these, you know, if I decided that I needed to come in and erase something, right, you can see that it handles erasing from electric eraser, or even a more even a thicker electric eraser, right? Still, it handles that really well. I can now come in and go back over that. There's no damage to the paper at all. And that's really what you want, right? I mean, you want a surface that is going to constantly be there for you, be able to take more, not abuse, but, you know, layers and erasing and adjustment and what have you. And then a lot of the other stuff as far as, you know, whether you want smooth or you want textured or you want toned or you want something that can be mixed media or whatever it is, it's a personal sort of choice. So I hope that this video has been helpful and useful. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope that everybody is doing well.